My brother was 7 years older than me, and I idolized him. He taught me how to play guitar when I was about a sophomore, a junior in high school. Then I had that band, and then when I went to the U and I had stopped playing with the band, Steve had come back and was in the master's program in English at the U, and so we would play in the coffee house together in the student union at the U. We got hired to play in Wessington, and we were so questionable that they wouldn't guarantee us anything, so we split the gate at the Wessington gym. I'll never forget, Mom and Dad came over to hear us. Half the songs, you'd start them but not finish them. You'd just sort of trail off into some pathetic noise. And really, by the time we were a few songs into it, the crowd had evacuated. People took a lot of pride in what came out of Miller, whether it was a musical production or the 1972 basketball team or, you know, the average ACT score. Everything about it was, I thought, just a cut above. I think the Ree Hills, with which you are very familiar, is one of the most beautiful places on earth. Oh, and, you know, Lake Louise, a beautiful gem of a little state park, 14 miles outside of Miller that hardly anybody knows about. Just gorgeous. That's where we learned to water ski. It's where we would spend weekends, and we wouldn't stay overnight. We'd just go out on Sundays and roll the boat up at dusk and skip rocks until Mom and Dad said it's time to go. The summer between my junior and senior year, I lived on the farm in Yankton. It was a different kind of farm work because the land's a lot richer. They raised soybeans and the corn's planted a lot closer together, and you walk every row of everything to remove any impurities. So that's what we did down there, as well as, I mean, they had a varied operation. They had cattle and they had hogs. But it was interesting because everything was saved. You'd come to the end of the row after you'd have a corn knife and you'd take the corn out of the soybeans, but you'd save it. And you'd cross the road and go to the hogs and dump it over the fence. I mean, everything was saved. It was a wild summer. Soybeans got to be over $11.50. Corn was high. Cattle were crazy high. People were making money. And it was the summer of '73, soon to be followed by some of the worst times. I will never forget the Sunday that my brother died before I left for Vermilion to go back to school. We were sitting on the radiator in our living room, and Steve was telling me all kinds of things. He said, "I just want you to remember that your mother shows her love for you through cooking." I thought, what a weird thing to say to me. You know, my brother and I, usually we would be sitting there playing guitars or something, but he was telling me some things he wanted me to know.
This gentleman informed me that they wanted 5 acres of my land for a pump station, and he told me that they would have to know in 2 days. It was just shoved down my throat. The guy at the Trans-Canada office, when I went down to talk to him, he said, "That's where the meteor dropped. This is where it's going to be." I had to do something, and I just thought of Scott, and it's the best thing I ever did. It wasn't long, and there was 40 more landowners. They wanted to be in it with me.
So many teachers that I have talked to that have just had it. They just don't know anywhere to go to change the storyline. If we don't get Scott elected, I don't know what will happen to education.
When one regime is in power for too long, inertia sets in, and pretty soon, you know, you do the same thing over and over and accept a different result. I think it's time for new leadership. It's time for a guy like Scott Heidepriem. We're at a crossroads now. We can make a choice.
Scott belongs in the kitchen. He can take the heat, and we need a governor who can take heat. We need a governor who's not simply interested in business as usual. We need somebody who leads rather than follows.
Dad used to have a line that he would use a lot that says, "Hey, anybody can be governor on a good day, but sometimes we don't have that many good days." And frankly, over the next couple of years, I'm afraid that we're not going to have that many good days coming up with respect to the economy and the budget. We're going to have, from all accounts, a $100 million budget shortfall in state government next year.
I don't know that I've ever told you why I wrote the history book, but my brother killed himself November of 1976, and Dad and I were going back to the airport in Pierre, taking relatives back to fly after the funeral. somehow the subject of the book came up. And I realized that that's one way I could stay close to Mom and Dad at a tough time for them. So that's what I did. Over the next 2 summers, I worked on the book and interviewed hundreds of people. Just loved it. I started by looking at original source material, old newspapers, talking to people. And you have to remember that in 1977, a lot of those old-timers were still around. So I would record all my interviews with them, and I'd sit in their living rooms, and they loved to talk about the Depression, for instance. I mean, that was a kind of a common theme, what it was like to live through the Depression. I like to do it. It's very interesting. I think everybody has it. I have yet to meet someone who doesn't have an interesting story to tell.
Our state government is in a financial crisis, and education isn't going to get another dollar until we fix that. We've got to get our priorities straight. We've got to cut back on the growth of state government in South Dakota. We've got to live within our means. We've got to be responsible with bidding contracts in this state. We've got to sell those darn airplanes.
The state population isn't growing. Why government would have to grow by double or more, I don't know. And the thing that saved us in the last couple of years is the fact that the federal government dumped in $200 million at the last minute.
I'm still a loyal Republican, and I'm going to vote for the best person. In the race for governor, the best person is Scott Heideprum.
What I really couldn't believe is the way the status quo of South Dakota at the time we were dealing with TransCanada is how they were willing to bend over backwards to help TransCanada, and more or less kind of forgetting about the landowner and the farmers like me that been here 125 years. It was just awful funny how they just got the green light for everything. The landowner seemed to be played second fiddle. I mean, just whatever TransCanada wanted them for them year and a half, they pretty much got. I think things need shaken up. From the candidates that I see, I think Scott's the best man.
Well, the first thing I'd do is I would stop flying around in state-owned airplanes, sell some airplanes, and try to fix the crumbling farm-to-market roads and bridges that we have in this state. I think we ought to change priorities in this state.
I do think South Dakota may need some planes. I don't know that that's true. I haven't experienced the job. I'm hoping to experience the job, but I don't think we can go back to horse and wagon either. You got to get around. It's a big state.
I need to remind the Lieutenant Governor that there is a phase of transportation between horse and buggy and airplanes. That's called driving, which is what most of us did to get to the state fair, which is what the governor of South Dakota could easily do, instead of flying at 30,000 feet looking down on crumbling roads and bridges throughout South Dakota.